far beneath the wind-carved valleys of Cappadocia, in modern-day Turkey, there exists a city that was never meant to see the sun. Its corridors twist downward into the earth like the burrow of some colossal, ancient creature. Its rooms are stacked in layers, descending story after story into darkness. Its stone doors, circular, heavy, impenetrable, were designed not to welcome guests, but to seal something in, or to keep something out. This is Derinkuyu. When it was rediscovered in 1963 by a man knocking down a wall in his basement, what emerged was not simply an archaeological curiosity. It was a question carved into volcanic rock, a question that echoes down 16 subterranean levels. What terrified ancient humans enough to build this? To understand the depth of that fear, you must imagine the world as it once was. Not a world of borders and satellites and instant communication, but a world of silence between settlements, a world where the horizon could conceal salvation or annihilation. Cappadocia is a landscape born of fire. Millions of years ago, volcanoes smothered the region in ash, which hardened into soft, tough stone. Wind and water sculpted it into fairy chimneys and rolling ridges. But beneath that sculpted beauty lay something else, possibility. The rock was soft enough to carve with primitive tools, yet strong enough to hold shape, a paradox of fragility and endurance. The earliest origins of Derinkuyu are debated, but some scholars trace its beginnings to the Hittites around the 2nd millennium BCE. These Bronze Age people were no strangers to existential threats. Their empire rose and fell amid rival kingdoms, internal rebellions, and mysterious collapses. The Late Bronze Age was an age of chaos. Entire civilizations vanished in what historians call the Bronze Age collapse. Cities burned, trade routes disappeared, writing systems were forgotten. If the Hittites began carving storage caves or rudimentary shelters into the tuff, perhaps it was not paranoia, perhaps it was prudence. Over centuries, the network expanded. Later came the Phrygians, who inherited the fractured lands after the Hittite decline. They too fortified, expanded, and refined what lay underground. Each generation may have deepened the chambers, widened the tunnels, added ventilation shafts that rose like hidden chimneys to the surface. Derinkuyu was not a simple cave. It was an engineered environment. Ventilation shafts plunged more than 50 meters deep, supplying air to the lowest levels. Wells provided water, some cleverly protected from surface contamination. There were stables for livestock, communal kitchens blackened by soot, storage rooms for grain and oil, wine presses, chapels, even schools. This was not a hiding spot for a night. This was a city designed to swallow thousands of people for months. Imagine the logistics of that. Entire families descending into the earth with animals, bedding, preserved food, tools, sacred texts. Massive circular stone doors, each weighing up to 500 kilograms, could be rolled into place from the inside. Sealing corridors. They could not be opened from the outside. Narrow passageways forced invaders to enter single file, if they could enter at all. Murder holes allowed defenders to spear or pour burning oil onto attackers. It is architecture shaped by dread. But dread of whom? Anatolia has always been a crossroads. Armies marched across it like storm fronts. The region fell under the control of the Roman Empire, whose legions brought order, roads, and taxation. Later, as Rome fractured Cappadocia, became a contested frontier between empires. When Christianity spread, the soft rock of the region became a sanctuary. Early Christians carved churches into cliffs, painting them with fading frescoes of saints and martyrs. Under the Byzantine Empire, Derinkuyu and neighboring underground cities likely saw their greatest expansion. This was not a peaceful era. Beginning in the 7th century, Arab-Byzantine wars ravaged the Midlands. Raiding parties swept through villages, capturing slaves, burning crops. Surface settlements were vulnerable. But underground, entire populations could vanish. Picture the alarm spreading across a Cappadocian village. Dust on the horizon. Riders approaching. Bells ringing. Families trained by generations of inherited fear, gathering children and livestock, descending familiar stairways into the earth, stone doors rolling shut, torches flickering, the sound of boots and shouting above, fading into muffled thuds. Above ground, silence and smoke. Below, breath and waiting. Yet, even this explanation, aids, invasions, warfare feels incomplete. Many regions endured invasions. Few responded by building multi-level subterranean metropolises capable of housing up to 20,000 people. The scale suggests not just episodic violence, but an expectation of recurrence. A worldview in which catastrophe was not rare, it was cyclical. In the 13th and 14th centuries, new terrors swept across Anatolia. The Mongols. Their campaigns were swift and merciless. Cities that resisted were annihilated. Survivors spoke of pyramids of skulls. Later still, conquerors like Timur carved bloody paths through the region. Derinkuyu may have offered one of the only defenses that worked against such forces: invisibility. An army cannot besiege what it cannot find. But warfare alone does not explain everything. There are deeper psychological layers embedded in the rock. Consider the engineering sophistication. Ventilation shafts were meticulously aligned. Waste disposal areas were separated from living quarters. Communal spaces were organized to maintain social cohesion. This was long-term habitation planning. It required cooperation, shared belief, and a collective acceptance that descending into darkness was preferable to remaining under open sky. To willingly move underground is to invert the natural order of human instinct. Humans are creatures of light. We orient by the sun. We build upward towers, monuments, spires. Yet here, generation after generation chose to build downward. That choice speaks of trauma. Perhaps it was not one singular terror, but accumulated memory. Oral histories of massacres. Stories of villages erased overnight. The knowledge that geography offered no natural fortifications, no high cliffs, no encircling rivers, except the earth itself. The volcanic tuff was both gift and temptation. Once the first chambers were carved, expansion became easier. Each crisis justified further excavation. A storage room became a tunnel became a level became a city. There is also a subtler possibility. Climate instability. Droughts. Harsh winters. The underground maintains a relatively constant temperature, cool in summer, warmer in winter. In times of crop failure, sheltering underground with preserved supplies could mean survival. Fear is rarely singular. It is layered, like the city itself. Religious fear may also have played a role. Early Christian communities in Cappadocia faced persecution during certain Roman periods. Hiding underground was not merely strategic, it was spiritual preservation. To protect sacred texts, clergy, and converts from execution required secrecy. Underground chapels in Derinkuyu suggest worship conducted in whispered hymns, candlelight reflecting off carved stone crosses. Imagine a child growing up partly below ground, learning to navigate tunnels before learning open fields, associating safety with enclosed walls and danger with sunlight. That psychology would shape a culture profoundly. And yet, life underground was no idle. Smoke from torches choked lungs. Air, though ventilated, would have been heavy. Space was limited. Privacy nearly non-existent. Animals shared levels with humans. The constant awareness of tons of rock overhead must have weighed on the mind. Still, they built when Derinkuyu was eventually abandoned. Gradually, over centuries, did not collapse. It simply slept. Entrances were sealed or forgotten. Surface life resumed dominance. New empires rose. The Ottoman era reshaped Anatolia. Modernity arrived with railways and republics. And beneath it all, the city waited. When that basement wall fell in 1963 and a hidden passage revealed darkness beyond, it was as though a throat cleared after centuries of silence. Archaeologists mapping the tunnels felt both awe and unease. The scale defied simple explanation. 8 levels were first cleared, then more. Eventually, 16 levels stretching approximately 60 meters deep were documented, though some believe even deeper sections remain unexplored. The paradox of Derinkuyu is this: it is both a testament to fear and to resilience. To carve such a refuge is to admit vulnerability. It is also to declare determination to survive at any cost. Perhaps what terrified ancient humans was not a single invading army, nor a singular apocalypse, Perhaps it was the knowledge that the world is unstable, that civilizations fall, that neighbors become enemies, that nature itself can betray. Above ground, history is written in ruins, burned cities, toppled columns, shattered gates. Below ground, history is written in precaution. Derinkuyu is precaution made monumental. As you descend its narrow stairways today, electric lights replacing torches, you can still feel it, the compression of space, the hush of stone, the uncanny sense that you are somewhere humans were never meant to thrive on, yet did. Stand in one of the deeper chambers and extinguish the light in your mind. Imagine only darkness and breath. Imagine waiting weeks for word that danger has passed. Imagine children asking when they can go outside. Imagine elders remembering the last time they hid like this and the time before that. What kind of world produces a people who believe the safest place is underground? The answer is not simple. It lies scattered across centuries of conflict, faith, famine, and memory. It lies in the psychology of borderlands, where empires collide and ordinary lives are crushed between them. It lies in geology, offering stone soft enough to shape but strong enough to shelter. It lies in the quiet calculation that survival sometimes demands retreat rather than resistance. Derinkuyu does not shout its secrets. It whispers them down corridors carved by hands long turned to dust. And as we begin to trace those whispers, descending level by level into the mind of the past, another question begins to form. Not about what terrified them, but about what sustained them in that darkness. For fear can drive humans underground, but hope is what allows them to endure their. If fear was the architect of the first chambers, memory was the engineer of the rest. Imagine the first descent not as tourists with railings and electric bulbs, but as villagers clutching oil lamps. The air cools quickly as you step below the surface of Cappadocia. The sounds of wind and animals fade. Your footsteps echo. The entrance narrows intentionally, forcing you to bow your head. This is not accidental architecture. It is psychological architecture. You must humble yourself before the earth. By the time Derinkuyu reached its full expansion, the underground city functioned like a living organism. Its ventilation shaft served as a central lung. The largest shaft drops more than 50 meters, doubling as a well. Fresh air could reach even the deepest levels, while smoke from kitchens filtered upward through carefully designed channels. This was not primitive panic digging. This was long-term planning refined over generations. But planning for what duration? Archaeologists estimate that as many as 15,000 to 20,000 people could shelter inside during emergencies. To support such numbers required foresight. Grain storage rooms were carved deep and cooled to preserve food. Olive oil jars could be sealed and stacked. Wine presses suggest both sustenance and ritual continuity. Livestock stalls were positioned near upper levels to manage waste and reduce the difficulty of moving animals. The layout reveals something intimate. They expected to return. This was not a tomb. It was a pause button on catastrophe. Above ground, the Anatolian plateau has always been exposed. Open terrain allows armies to move quickly. For much of late antiquity and the medieval era, this region formed a volatile frontier between the Byzantine Empire and expanding Islamic caliphates. Arab-Byzantine conflicts from the 7th to 10th centuries turned central Anatolia into a zone of raids rather than stable occupation. Villages might flourish for years, then be emptied overnight. These were not necessarily full-scale invasions. They were fast-moving incursions, horsemen seizing supplies, captives, and livestock before retreating. Against such tactics, city walls often failed, but invisibility could succeed. It is difficult for modern minds to grasp the frequency of uncertainty in pre-modern borderlands. We imagine invasions as rare, defining events. For them, danger may have been seasonal. A rumor in spring, a distant plume of smoke in summer, a messenger arriving breathless with warning. Each warning would reinforce collective memory. Each survival underground would justify deeper excavation. Parents would tell children, "This tunnel saved your grandmother." The earth would become synonymous with deliverance. The underground chapels carved into Derinkuyu hint at another layer of terror. Religious vulnerability. Christianity, though eventually dominant in the Byzantine realm, endured cycles of persecution earlier under certain Roman authorities. And even after imperial endorsement, frontier Christians faced pressures from rival powers. Hiding clergy, manuscripts, and sacred objects would have been paramount. Fresco fragments found in subterranean churches mirror artistic traditions seen in surface monasteries throughout Cappadocia. Similar rock-cut sanctuaries can be found in places like Gogrim, where entire monastic complexes were carved into cliffs. The difference is that Derinkuyu descends rather than clings to rock faces. It disappears instead of displaying devotion. What kind of theology develops in darkness? Perhaps one that emphasizes endurance. The metaphor of burial and resurrection would feel literal when you ascend after weeks below. Emerging into sunlight would resemble rebirth. Children raised with such rhythms might internalize a cyclical understanding of threat and renewal. And yet, warfare and religion still may not fully explain the depth. Consider the psychological residue of the Bronze Age collapse centuries earlier, when even mighty powers like the Hittites disintegrated. Though Derinkuyu's major expansions occurred later, cultural memory in Anatolia carried stories of sudden civilizational collapse. Trade networks failing, famine spreading, neighbors turning hostile. Trauma, once embedded in a region, does not vanish easily. It becomes myth. It becomes cautionary proverb. It becomes architecture. There is also environmental volatility to consider. Cappadocia's continental climate brings hot summers and harsh winters. Underground temperatures remain stable year-round, hovering around 13 degrees Celsius, 55 degrees Fahrenheit. In times of extreme cold, surface dwellings would struggle. During drought, storing water in protected wells would prove life-saving. If a series of particularly brutal winters or crop failures struck during periods of political instability, the underground city would transition from emergency shelter to seasonal refuge. The engineering sophistication suggests accumulated experimentation. Early chambers may have suffered from poor ventilation or flooding. Later expansions corrected these flaws. Narrow connecting corridors could be sealed individually, compartmentalizing threats. Massive stone doors, round and thick, were designed to be rolled into place from inside. A small central hole allowed communication or spear thrusts, but prevented forced entry. It is a design born from anticipating intelligent enemies. The Mongol incursions of the 13th century added new chapters to Anatolia's trauma. When the armies of the Mongols advanced westward, they demonstrated terrifying mobility. Cities that resisted were annihilated. News of such destruction travels faster than armies. Fear multiplies in imagination before a single rider arrives. Even if Derinkuyu predates the Mongols' arrival, its continued use during that era would have validated generations of excavation. You see, elders could say, the earth protects. But life underground was not merely defensive. It required governance. Who decided when to descend? Who rationed grain? Who managed waste disposal to prevent disease? Social hierarchies must have adapted to subterranean conditions. Leadership underground required calm authority. Panic in confined spaces is deadly. Perhaps drills were practiced. Perhaps children were taught routes to specific chambers. The city's layout suggests zoning. Animals near entrances, communal areas deeper, religious spaces centrally placed. Schools indicate education continued during refuge. Knowledge itself was considered worth preserving. The existence of missionary schools in Cappadocia during Byzantine times supports the notion that intellectual life persisted even amid threat. Imagine lessons conducted by lamplight, the faint smell of oil in the air, teachers' voices echoing softly off stone. There is something profoundly human about refusing to let culture dive in while hiding. One of the strangest aspects of Derinkuyu is its connectivity. Tunnels link it to other underground cities miles away, including the vast complex at Cappadocia. Some passages stretch for kilometers. These were not random caves. They formed a regional network, a hidden infrastructure beneath the plateau. This suggests coordination between settlements. Perhaps signal systems, smoke mirrors, runners warned neighboring communities. Perhaps alliances were forged around shared refuge spaces. The underground became not just protection, but a unifying identity. And yet, despite all this preparation, The surface always called them back. Agriculture demanded sunlight. Trade required roads. Life could not remain buried indefinitely. This oscillation between exposure and concealment defines the Derinkuyu paradox. Humans are creatures of openness, yet here they engineered survival through enclosure. Was it only external enemies that drove them downward? Some scholars speculate about internal strife, banditry, local feuds, political purges. Frontier regions often harbor power struggles independent of grand empires. If a rival faction seized a town, retreating underground might buy time until negotiations or reinforcements arrived. There is also the ever-present specter of plague. While evidence directly linking Derinkuyu to epidemic response is limited, confined yet ventilated environments could isolate communities from contagion spreading along trade routes. During pandemics, such as the plague of Justinian in the 6th century, fear of invisible enemies rivaled fear of armies. In such times, the earth would feel like a barrier, not only against swords, but against unseen breath. But darkness has its own dangers. Extended stays underground, strain mental health, claustrophobia, insomnia, irritability. These are modern terms for ancient experiences. Maintaining morale required ritual, songs sung softly, stories told repeatedly, faith reinforced. The very act of carving deeper may have provided psychological comfort. Each new chamber symbolized control in a world of chaos. We can prepare, the stones seemed to say. We are not helpless. Centuries passed, empires shifted. The rise of the Ottoman Empire in the 14th and 15th centuries gradually stabilized Anatolia under centralized rule. As frontier warfare diminished in Cappadocia, the need for massive underground refuge decreased. The city was not dramatically abandoned. Rather, it faded from necessity. Some local populations, particularly Christian minorities, continued to use sections for protection during intermittent unrest well into the Ottoman era. But eventually, memory thinned. Entrances were sealed or repurposed as storage. Surface life dominated. What remains astonishing is that Derinkuyu was never destroyed. No conqueror bothered collapsing it entirely. Perhaps they never fully discovered its scope. Perhaps it simply ceased to be strategically relevant, and so it slept. When modern excavations began after its accidental rediscovery in 1963, only a fraction of the network was initially accessible. As archaeologists cleared debris, they realized they were mapping not a cave system, but a planned city. Staircases aligned vertically across levels. Living quarters clustered logically. The design reflected centuries of accumulated engineering wisdom. The paradox sharpened. Why does such monumental effort leave so few written records? The people who built and expanded Derinkuyu did not leave behind blueprints or manifestos explaining their motivations. Their explanation lies in the stone itself. Perhaps the answer is simpler than we wish. Perhaps ancient humans built Derinkuyu because they understood something we often forget. Stability is temporary. Modern societies build insurance policies, digital backups, emergency bunkers. We stockpile data in underground vaults carved into Arctic mountains. We construct shelters against nuclear fallout. In a sense, Derinkuyu is an ancient analog to contemporary anxiety. Fear of invasion, fear of collapse, fear of environmental disaster, fear of the unknown. The difference is scale and intimacy. Their refuge was communal, not individual. Survival depended on cooperation. Thousands breathing the same air, sharing the same grain stores, trusting that someone above would signal when it was safe. Imagine the moment of emergence after a long confinement. The stone door rolled aside, light spilling down stairwells, the smell of grass and wind flooding lungs, children blinking, shielding eyes, adults scanning the horizon for smoke. Each emergence would confirm both vulnerability and resilience. Derinkuyu stands today, not as a monument to terror alone, but as evidence of adaptation. The ancient inhabitants of Cappadocia did not control invading armies, climate swings, or imperial politics, but they controlled their response. They carved certainty into uncertainty. As we continue descending through history's layers, we begin to see that the question, what terrified them, cannot be separated from what sustained them. Fear may have driven the first chisel into volcanic tuff, but love of family, of faith of future generations drove the city deeper and deeper still. Standing in the dim lower chambers of Derinkuyu, imagination becomes heavier than the rock above you. The air feels thick, carrying centuries of breath. Every carved wall is a fingerprint. Every worn stair edge is a memory of hurried descent. If fear began the excavation, repetition perfected it. Picture Cappadocia not as a postcard, but a frontier under tension. Its open plateau offered little natural defense. No dense forests or jagged mountain fortresses. Instead, rolling terrain, porous and beautiful, but exposed. In such a place, survival required imagination. Earliest inhabitants began modestly. Simple storage caves for grain, cool chambers to preserve harvests from heat. This was practical, not desperate. The volcanic tuff invited carving. A farmer needing a root cellar would discover the earth yielded easily to hammer and chisel. Utility breeds opportunity. Once a family realizes a chamber stays cool, they expand it. Once a community recognizes enemies ride past without noticing a concealed entrance, they connect tunnels. Each small advantage accumulates into strategy. In the centuries following the decline of the Hittites, Anatolia fractured into smaller powers. Among them were the Phrygians, who inherited a land accustomed to instability. But what transforms a cellar into a city? It is not a single invasion. It is generational anxiety. Imagine a grandmother telling her grandchildren about night riders, how flames consumed wheat fields, how neighbors disappeared, how they survived only because a hidden chamber concealed them. The story is repeated each winter. The children grow up inheriting its lesson. Prepare. The tunnels grow wider. Under Roman rule, Cappadocia became a province. Roman governance brought relative order, yet even Rome's shadow could not eliminate local vulnerability. Banditry plagued rural provinces. Political upheavals in distant capitals reverberated outward. Armies loyal to rival emperors marched for villagers. The difference between imperial factions mattered less than survival. Later, as the empire split, Cappadocia's strategic location hardened into frontier reality. Arab-Byzantine conflicts transformed central Anatolia into contested ground for centuries. Raiding parties fast, disciplined, relentless struck settlements and withdrew before large forces could respond. In such warfare, walls were insufficient. By the time a lookout spotted dust clouds, riders were near. But an underground entrance concealed within a courtyard that could vanish an entire population. The design of Derinkuyu reflects this urgency. Corridors narrow sharply at intervals. At key choke points, massive circular stone doors could be rolled shut from inside. These doors, carved from volcanic rock, fit so precisely that breaching them was nearly impossible. This is architecture anticipating pursuit. Yet the deeper one descends, the more domestic the spaces become. Kitchens with blackened ceilings. Storage rooms carved with shelves. Sleeping quarters modest but numerous. And chapels simple yet intentional where faith was practiced under the earth. Religion in darkness acquires new symbolism. Early Christians spoke of trial, awaiting deliverance. To physically descend beneath the earth while believing in resurrection would amplify those metaphors. When communities emerged after danger passed, the act itself echoed rebirth. Nearby, in Gogrim, monastic complexes were carved into cliff faces, their frescoes still visible. Those were statements of visible devotion. Derinkuyu was devotion concealed. The difference reveals the spectrum of security across the region. And what of the children? It is easy to imagine warriors and elders shaping decisions. But it was children who adapted most quickly to underground life. They would memorize tunnel networks like playground maps. They would chase each other through passages. For them, the city below may have felt less like prison and more like adventure. Until the tone of adult voices shifted. When fear returned, even games would quiet. Water management was crucial. The central ventilation shaft doubled as a well. Yet some wells were designed to be inaccessible from the surface. This prevented enemies from poisoning the water supply. The sophistication suggests learned caution. Perhaps at some point, a community suffered after surface wells were contaminated. Memory would ensure the mistake was not repeated. There is also evidence of food processing areas deep underground. Wine presses indicate viticulture. Wine, beyond nutrition, carries ritual and psychological comfort. In confined spaces, small ceremonies, shared cups, whispered prayers would sustain morale. Social order underground must have been delicate. Noise carries easily in stone corridors. Arguments would echo. Leadership likely enforced strict routines. Light sources were precious. Oil had to be rationed. Cooking smoke had to be controlled. Waste disposal required designated areas to prevent disease. Survival underground was not passive hiding. It was disciplined living. The Mongol expansion in the 13th century reawakened ancient fears across Anatolia. News of entire cities destroyed would have reached Cappadocia long before armies themselves. Even if Derinkuyu was not directly attacked, its very existence offered psychological insurance. When catastrophe feels unpredictable, preparation becomes identity. But here lies the paradox. If generations invested such labor, why so little inscriptional evidence? Perhaps because explanation was unnecessary to them. When a threat is constant, you do not write manifestos, you carve it. Consider also the possibility of coordinated underground networks. These connections stretch for kilometers. This implies planning beyond a single village. Entire communities must have shared refuge strategies. Signals may have traveled above ground mirrors, flashing sunlight, smoke patterns, runners on horseback. Upon warning, villages would descend almost simultaneously, sealing entrances behind them. An invading force might arrive to find livestock gone, doors barred, homes eerily empty, silence as defense. The psychological effect on attackers must have been unsettling. An empty settlement offers no spoils, no captives, no immediate confrontation. It denies the invader's satisfaction. Invisibility can be a weapon. Yet invisibility has cost. Prolonged confinement strains body and mind. Without sunlight, circadian rhythms falter. Nutrition becomes limited to stored supplies. Tension rises in tight quarters. Maintaining hope requires narrative. Perhaps elders told stories of past survivals, of the fall of the Hittites. Perhaps they spoke of distant capitals of emperors, in Constantinople whose political struggles determined whether raids intensified or eased. But underground, imperial politics felt abstract. What mattered was whether footsteps sounded above. There is another dimension, seldom considered: economic fear. Trade routes crossing Anatolia linked east and west. When conflict disrupted caravans, famine followed. Storing surplus grain could stabilize a community. In that sense, Derinkuyu was both bunker and granary. And perhaps, over time, the act of carving became ritualized. Young men proving adulthood. Craftsmen refining ventilation, families sponsoring chapels, the city growing not only from fear, but from pride. We endure, the stone declared. As centuries progressed and the Ottoman Empire consolidated control, frontier instability diminished, the need for mass subterranean refuge lessened, large-scale occupation declined. Surface villages evolved, memories softened, entrances were hidden, repurposed, forgotten, until, in 1963, a man renovating his basement knocked through a wall and discovered darkness extending beyond expectation. What began as a household curiosity unfolded into archaeological astonishment. Excavation revealed a city layered with intention. Its corridors silent but eloquent. Today, visitors descend safely, guided by electric light. Yet, if you pause in one of the deeper chambers and close your eyes, you can almost hear the murmurs, the shuffle of sandals, the distant lowing of livestock. A child whispering questions. A leader's calm voice. What terrified ancient humans enough to build this? By now, the answer feels less like a single event and more like an atmosphere of uncertainty that settled over centuries. Invasions, raids, political collapses, environmental hardship, all layered like sediment. Each generation added its own depth. But beneath terror lay something more enduring. Trust. Trust that neighbors would cooperate. Trust that leaders would ration fairly. Trust that the earth would hold. Without trust, Derinkuyu would have been impossible. Fear may have driven them underground, but trust allowed them to survive there and As we continue deeper into this paradox, we begin to sense that Derinkuyu is not merely a relic of ancient anxiety. It is a mirror reflecting the timeless human instinct to prepare for the worst, while quietly hoping never to need what we build. There is a peculiar stillness in the deepest levels of Derinkuyu, not the peaceful stillness of a quiet meadow, but the dense, waiting silence of stone that has witnessed fear. By the time you descend several levels, the air cools and steadies. Sound behaves differently. A whisper carries farther than expected. A dropped pebble echoes longer than it should. Imagine this amplified by darkness, true darkness, broken only by trembling oil lamps. In such an environment, emotion becomes contagious. Calm spreads slowly. Panic spreads instantly. The architects of Derinkuyu understood this, even if they never wrote it down. The layout of the city reveals psychological intelligence. Upper levels were likely used first during emergencies. Livestock stalls appear near entrances, suggesting that animals were brought in quickly and secured close to the surface. Humans descended deeper. Narrow choke points forced bodies into single file, preventing chaotic crowding. Massive stone doors could be rolled shut section by section, isolating parts of the city if necessary. This is not only defense against invaders, it is defense against disorder. In frontier regions like Cappadocia, instability was rarely dramatic and singular. It was repetitive. The long conflict between the Byzantine Empire and early Islamic powers meant that central Anatolia endured cycles of raids over centuries. Some years passed quietly, others did not. The unpredictability was the terror. When danger is unpredictable, preparation becomes permanent. We often imagine ancient communities as reactive. Derinkuyu suggests they were strategic. Generations added improvements. Ventilation shafts were carefully aligned to reach multiple levels. Some shafts were narrow enough to prevent an adult from climbing down icily from the surface, reducing vulnerability. Water wells were protected in ways that indicate prior knowledge of siege tactics. Even waste disposal was considered. Designated areas for refuse and latrines were placed carefully to avoid contaminating living quarters. Hygiene underground is not optional, it is survival. But beyond logistics lies something deeper: trust in collective discipline. Picture thousands descending in coordinated urgency. There is no time for argument, no space for selfishness. Grain must be shared, oil rationed, noise controlled. The success of the underground refuge depended on communal cohesion. Fear fractures societies, but it can also bind them tightly. The earlier collapse of the Hittites may have lingered in regional memory as a cautionary tale of disunity. When the great can crumble, the small must prepare. Later threats reinforced this lesson. During periods of Roman instability under the Roman Empire, soldiers loyal to rival emperors traversed provinces. Villages could not always predict which banner would appear on the horizon. Under such conditions, an underground refuge offered neutrality. You cannot conscript what you cannot find. Religious life underground adds another dimension to the paradox. Chapels carved into lower levels of Derinkuyu are modest yet deliberate. Stone benches line the walls. Simple crosses are etched without ornament. Worship here was not public display, it was preservation. In nearby Gogrim, rock-cut churches bloom with frescoes, color surviving across centuries. Above ground, faith could be expressive. Below ground, faith became quiet endurance. One can imagine liturgy whispered in dim light, while children sleep against stone walls. The metaphor of descending into the earth, burial, and resurrection would resonate deeply when lived physically. Emerging after weeks underground into sunlight would feel almost sacred. But faith alone does not sustain bodies. Food storage chambers at Derinkuyu are carved deep where temperature remains constant. Grain bins line walls. Pressing rooms for wine suggest preparation for long stays. Wine, beyond sustenance, carries ritual and morale. Sharing it underground would reinforce unity. The interconnected tunnels linking Derinkuyu to Kamakok reveal regional foresight. These were not isolated bunkers. They were nodes in a hidden network beneath the plateau. Communities likely maintained communication systems above ground. When warning came, descent would not be chaotic improvisation. It would be rehearsed memory. Then came new waves of terror. In the 13th century, as the armies of the Mongols swept westward, the psychological shock was immense. Cities from China to Eastern Europe fell. News of destruction often arrived before the armies themselves. Even if Derinkuyu was not directly besieged, its existence during this era would have felt prophetic. Our ancestors were wise, elders might say. Later, shifting powers eventually gave rise to the Ottoman Empire. As Ottoman control stabilized much of Anatolia, frontier volatility diminished. The necessity for mass underground refuge decreased gradually. Not overnight, memory does not relax quickly, but over generations. Sections of Derinkuyu may have continued in use, particularly by minority communities, during intermittent unrest. Yet eventually, the underground city became more storage than sanctuary. Entrances were sealed. Knowledge narrowed to a few families. The paradox deepens here. If fear birthed the city, what happens when fear recedes? Does the architecture become obsolete? Does it become myth? Over time, the subterranean labyrinth slipped from collective consciousness. Surface life expanded. Houses were built atop hidden chambers without awareness of their depth. Children grew up unaware that beneath their courtyards lay 16 levels, until one day in 1963, when a man renovating his home broke through a wall and discovered open space beyond. What he found was not a small cave, but a passage leading into darkness that did not end. Archaeologists soon realized the magnitude of the discovery. Derinkuyu extended approximately 60 meters below ground. Not all levels are open even today. Some remain partially blocked. Others stretch beyond mapped corridors. It is tempting to ask whether something even older lies beneath the known levels. But even without speculation, what exists is staggering enough. Why carve so deep? Because surface security was never permanent. Because generations inherited stories of fire and riders. Because geology offered opportunity. Because cooperation made it possible. Perhaps the most profound terror was not any specific army, but the understanding that stability is fragile. Empires rise and fall. Alliances shift. Climate turns harsh. Neighbors change allegiance. Trade routes collapse. In such a world, what do you build? They built downward. Derinkuyu is not a monument to cowardice. It is a monument to continuity. It represents a decision. When chaos arrives, we will not scatter. We will descend together. We will wait. We will emerge when it is safe. There is courage in that patience. Stand in the deepest accessible chamber and imagine the weight of rock above tons upon tons. Ancient engineers trusted the tough stone to hold. They trusted one another to remain calm. They trusted that danger above was temporary. Fear drove them underground. But hope scheduled their return. And perhaps that is the truest answer to the paradox. The city beneath Cappadocia was not built solely because they were terrified. It was built because they believed survival was worth the effort. Because they intended to see the sun again. There is something profoundly unsettling about a city that was never meant to be seen. Above ground, civilizations announce themselves with towers, walls, monuments, inscriptions. They build upward to declare permanence. But beneath the plains of Cappadocia, the builders of Derinkuyu chose concealment over proclamation. Their masterpiece was silence. To understand the fifth layer of this paradox, we must step beyond warfare and ask a quieter question. What does it do to a culture when hiding becomes tradition? Imagine a child born into a village where the entrance to the underground city sits discreetly inside a courtyard. The child grows up playing near it, warned not to wander too deep alone. At night, grandparents tell stories, not fairy tales of dragons, but true stories of raids, of smoke on the horizon, of entire communities disappearing into stone and surviving. Fear becomes inheritance, but so does competence. By the time Derinkuyu reached its full complexity, 16 levels, descending nearly 60 meters, it was no longer merely a reaction to immediate threat. It was infrastructure embedded in identity. The ventilation systems, carved meticulously to channel fresh air to the deepest chambers, demonstrate accumulated engineering knowledge. The central shaft, serving both as air conduit and well, reflects an understanding of sustainability during extended confinement. This was preparation for duration. not momentary concealment. Under the long shadow of the Byzantine Empire, Cappadocia functioned as a frontier zone for centuries. Frontier life shapes mentality. People living at the edges of empires develop resilience and suspicion in equal measure. They learn that distant capitals, whether in Constantinople or elsewhere, cannot always respond in time. Self-reliance becomes doctrine. And yet Derinkuyu required cooperation beyond individual families. Estimates suggest up to 20,000 people could shelter within its chambers. That scale demands social organization. Who had authority underground? Was there a council of elders, a military leader, clergy guiding both prayer and discipline? We may never know names, but the architecture suggests hierarchy without tyranny. Storage rooms are communal, not private vaults. Kitchens appear shared. Livestock areas are positioned strategically to minimize contamination. Such coordination implies trust in collective governance. Trust is fragile in times of fear. Perhaps that is the true marvel, not that they built downward, but that they maintained unity while doing so. Consider the long memory of Anatolia. The collapse of the Hittites, centuries earlier, would have echoed as legend. Later, incursions by Arab forces during the early Islamic expansions reinforced vulnerability. Then came the thundering hooves of the Mongols in the 13th century, whose campaigns reshaped Eurasia with terrifying speed. Even if Derinkuyu's deepest expansions predate the Mongols, the psychological atmosphere of the medieval world was saturated with stories of annihilation. Cities burned for resisting, entire populations enslaved. Against such narratives, an underground city is more than stone. It is defiance. Yet there is a dimension seldom discussed: internal fear. Not only fear of foreign armies, but fear of neighbors turning against neighbors in times of famine or political collapse. Social bonds strain. Banditry increases. Opportunistic violence erupts. A hidden refuge offers protection not only from organized invasion, but from chaotic desperation. If a harvest failed across central Anatolia, communities would feel the pressure immediately. Grain stores shrink. Tempers flare. Trade caravans falter. An underground granary insulated from raiders might preserve enough to endure until the next season. Climate in Cappadocia is harsh. Winters bite. Summers scorch. Underground chambers maintain a relatively constant temperature, providing natural insulation. During extreme cold, retreating below would conserve fuel and warmth. During heat waves, the cool stone would offer relief. In this sense, Derinkuyu was also adaptation to environment. But darkness changes perception. Without the sun, time dissolves into routine, measured by oil consumption and rationed meals. To maintain psychological stability, rituals matter. We know that Cappadocia was a center of early Christian thought, producing theologians and monastic communities. Worship underground would not merely be defensive, it would be grounding. In nearby Gogrim, rock-hewn churches display vibrant frescoes. At Derinkuyu, decoration is sparse. Survival took precedence over beauty. Yet the presence of chapels at all suggests that even during concealment, spiritual life continued uninterrupted. Faith under stone becomes intimate. The interconnected tunnels linking Derinkuyu to Kamakuk hint at regional solidarity. Perhaps alliances formed among villages sharing refuge networks. In a crisis, multiple communities might descend simultaneously, coordinating through prearranged signals. Picture an invader arriving at what appears to be an abandoned settlement. No livestock in fields. No people in homes. Wells sealed. Silence. Confusion becomes deterrent. An enemy cannot conquer what refuses to present itself. Yet, the underground strategy has limits. Crops cannot be tended from beneath rock. Trade cannot be conducted invisibly. So the people of Cappadocia oscillated between exposure and concealment farming, building, marrying above ground, hiding, waiting, enduring below. This rhythm defines the Derinkuyu paradox. When the Ottoman Empire eventually consolidated control over Anatolia, extended frontier warfare in this region diminished. Over generations, the need for mass descent lessened. The underground city transitioned from active refuge to dormant resource. Memory, however, does not vanish neatly. Some entrances were walled off intentionally. Others were forgotten as new houses rose above old shafts. Knowledge of deeper levels faded to rumor. A grandmother might mention hidden tunnels, but without recent crisis, the urgency dulled. Then came modernity, roads, republic, electricity. The underground slept unnoticed beneath contemporary life, until 1963, when a man knocking down a wall in his home discovered a passage leading into darkness that did not end. What began as curiosity became revelation. Archaeologists descended, mapping corridors, counting levels, measuring shafts. The modern world stared at what ancient fear had built, and perhaps felt something familiar, because Derinkuyu mirrors modern anxieties more than we admit. Today, nations construct bunkers against nuclear war. Data vaults are carved into Arctic mountains. Wealthy individuals build private shelters, stocked for apocalypse. The impulse is unchanged. When uncertainty grows, we dig. The difference lies in scale of community. Derinkuyu was communal survival, not individual escape. Its chambers were not private fortresses, but shared space. Survival required cooperation, not isolation. That may be its most radical lesson. What terrified ancient humans enough to build this? Not just armies, not just raids, not just famine. It was the recognition that history is unstable. Empires like the Roman Empire once seemed eternal, yet fractured. Powers rise and dissolve. Climate shifts. Trade falters. The surface world, however bright, is vulnerable. So they carved a second world. One that did not seek glory. One that did not seek conquest. Only continuity. Stand again in one of Derinkuyu's deeper rooms and imagine thousands breathing quietly. Oil lamps flicker. Children sleep curled against walls. Above, wind crosses empty fields. Hoofbeats pass without stopping. Below, hearts beat steadily. Fear built the entrance. Memory deepened the tunnels. Hope waited by the door. And when the stone rolled aside and sunlight spilled down the stairwell, they climbed upward, not defeated, but intact. That is the quiet triumph hidden beneath Cappadocia's soil. Not that they were afraid, but that they refused to disappear.